Mr. Sharma, a few months out from COP26, how are we going to judge whether this meeting, whether this conference is a success?
Well, Christian, I think the first thing to say is that climate change, indeed biodiversity loss, are the biggest challenges that are facing humanity right now. And the reality is the warning lights are flashing bright red. What we want to do in Glasgow, of course, it's the UN climate conference. We will be bringing together world leaders to make commitments so that we keep and limit global warming to 1.5 degrees and keep that 1.5 degree target within reach, which is what was agreed at Paris.
Haven't most of the commitments, the big commitments from the big nations, been made? China says it'll be carbon neutral by 2060. America's made big pledges, and of course Britain has as well. So, I mean, what is there left to sort?
Yeah, so if you look at the commitments that have been made, when the UK government was first announced to have the COP presidency back in 2019, less than 30% of the world economy was covered by a net zero target. We're now at 70%, and we're urging all countries to come forward with net zero commitments. But of course, what's also vitally important are those near-term commitments to reduce emissions by 2030. And as you said, we have seen over the past week commitments made so that every G7 nation now has a 2030 emission reductions targets, which puts it on a pathway to net zero by 2050. But of course, we need to make much more progress on this. We have very many more countries that we need to come forward to ensure that we do keep that 1.5 degree global warming within reach. And the reality is that the science tells us we are already over 1 degree warming. And you see the impact of that, Krishnan, in the UK, you see that around the world, flooding, droughts, sea level rises, crops being destroyed, glaciers melting. I mean, all of that is the impact of climate change and global warming. And that is why it's vital we get this under control.
One of your biggest challenges as the British leader of this conference, though, is going to be to elevate the voices of the unheard, the least powerful nations, the poorest nations, the ones who get frozen out in these talks between the giants. How are you going to do that?
Well, Christian, I've been very clear during my presidency role is that I see myself very much as a champion for developing countries. And one of the big issues for developing countries is financial support to help them cope with the impacts of climate change. And donor countries agreed that by 2020, $100 billion a year would be raised to support developing countries, climate vulnerable countries. We need to make sure that that is delivered. It is a matter of trust. It's a totemic figure. And that is something that we're working very hard to ensure happens.
Have you not got those pledges yet? I mean, surely this could have been sorted out.
Well, we know that the latest figures are from a few years ago that the OECD reports say that we're at just under 80 billion a year that's going into climate finance. But of course, what we need to do is to get to that 100 billion, but also find ways that we can then ensure that private sector money also comes into climate resilient infrastructure. And the reality is that we know that trillions of dollars is going to be required over the coming years to ensure that we tackle climate change and that we put in place a structure to ensure that countries are able to deal with the impacts of climate change that have already occurred.
Isn't there a massive gap, though, between the pledges of what will happen decades away and the reality, the actual mechanisms that we're going to deliver this through? And that's what you really need to extract from world governments, including Britain, at COP26. The reality of what this means.
Yeah, so I think, as I said, the one is for countries to make those pledges to be net zero emissions by the middle of the century. The other are those near-term targets by 2030 to ensure that we can see a credible pathway to net zero for those countries. And that's why those 2030 emission reduction targets are so important. You will have heard in the last week, Christian, the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, announced that the UK is now committing to reduce our emissions by 78% by the year 2035. That is a world-leading commitment, and we are looking to other countries to follow suit.
But are you being honest with people around the world about what that means for their own lives, their own spending? Are we being honest with people about what they're going to have to spend to change the heating systems in their homes and the transport systems and cars that they're using to get around?
Well, Christian, I think the cost of inaction is far greater than the cost of action. You'll have seen the Stern review that came out some years ago, which set out the potential cost to the global economy of unabated climate change, up to 20% of global GDP. What we are seeing is that it is possible to do green growth. In our country, over a 30-year period, we've managed to grow our economy by 75% and yet cut emissions by 43%. So this is possible. I do think the UK is a poster child for this, and we are urging all countries to come forward and, as we recover from COVID, to have those green recovery plans to build back better, to build back green.
But don't you need to go to the household level and say to people as well, you're going to have to invest in this yourselves as individuals. It's going to cost you because the government isn't going to pay for everything.
Well, of course, there will be some cost to this, but you also have to look at what the upside is. And since we talk about costs, the Independent Committee on Climate Change came out with a report a few years ago, which said the cost of this would be 1 to 2% of GDP by 2050. At the latest report they've put out, it says 0.5%. And the reason for that is the cost of clean technologies has been falling rapidly. So you see the cost of solar dropping by over 40% over a 10-year period. You see the cost of offshore wind down by 70% over a 10-year period as well. And so, there is a real opportunity for countries around the world to ensure that we build back greener. And that means investing in these green technologies, creating jobs, which is also what really matters. You will have know that at the end of last year, we set out our 10-point plan. The Prime Minister set out this plan for a green industrial revolution in the UK that was about investing public money, leveraging in multiples of that from the private sector, building those sunrise industries of the future, and creating tens of jobs. That's what we need to do. We need to deliver green growth in our country, and that's what the world needs to do globally as well.
In terms of global leadership, Britain has a good track record on energy and its transition to renewable energy and cutting coal. It's got a good record in terms of its commitments. Where it's lacking is what you mentioned right at the beginning of this, which is biodiversity, protecting nature, changing our natural habitats and saving species. I mean, don't we need to do a lot more on that?
Well, that's an incredibly important area, and climate change and biodiversity are two sides of the same coin. But the UK is leading in this area as well. We have pledged, the Prime Minister's pledged £3 billion for nature to support countries around the world. And we've also led on the Leaders Pledge for Nature. Over 80 leaders around the world have signed up to this. We are ensuring that the campaign for countries to protect 30% of their land and 30% of their waters as well is something that happens over the coming period. So the UK is leading on this, but what we need to ensure that every country is doing the same as well.
But again, isn't there a gap between the words and the action?
Well, as I said, we've been very clear that we're going to be spending £3 billion on supporting nature through our international climate finance commitments. We are pushing the Leaders Pledge for Nature. We're pushing the 30 by 30 campaign. And of course, we're also ensuring to work with countries to stop deforestation. I think the UK can be very proud of the work that we are doing, both in terms of nature and indeed in terms of tackling climate change.
The challenge is obviously enormous. How important in truth is COP26 when the big commitments from America and China have already been made, and when COP26 can't be the event it was going to be with 40,000 people in Glasgow and international delegations coming from everywhere because of the pandemic? I mean, is it actually now a bit overblown?
Well, Christian, Glasgow absolutely has to be the moment that the world comes together and agrees on commitments that limit the worst impacts of climate change. This has to be the moment that we do it. And as I've said to you, we can see around the world the impacts of climate change. I have met communities around the world through my work on COP who have been absolutely devastated because of the impacts of climate change. They've literally had to move their homes because of flooding, because of drought. And that is something that will unfortunately intensify unless we deliver on tackling climate change. So Glasgow is vitally important. And you talk about the event itself. We are very clear. My team and I are working to ensure that we have a physical meeting. That is what countries around the world want. developing countries particularly want to ensure that they're sitting at the same table physically with the large countries, with the large emitters as part of those negotiations. And of course, we've already delayed COP26 by 1 year, and climate change hasn't abated in that time. Indeed, last year was the warmest year on record. The last decade was the warmest decade on record. Now is the time to act. Now is the time for the world to come together in Glasgow and make real progress so that we can keep that 1.5-degree target within reach.
But are the big power blocks, Europe, China, America, India, with Britain in truth, especially after Brexit and after COP26, on the margins, struggling to be heard?
Well, as I said to you, when we were first announced to have the COP26 presidency, less than 30% of the world economy was covered by a net zero target. We worked with friends and partners around the world, and that figure is now 70% of the world economy covered by a net zero target. So absolutely, the UK is ensuring that we're showing leadership. And what's been really important as well, Krishna, as part of this, is that at the same time that we ask other countries to show ambition, we ourselves are showing ambition as well. We set out our nationally determined contribution, those emission reduction targets for 2030 at the end of last year, where we said we would cut emissions by at least 68% by 2030. And we've built on that. We are now saying that we will cut emissions by 78% by 2035. That is something that the world recognizes as true leadership.
Personally for you, I mean, as you lead this, I mean, has it been very frustrating for you, for example, seeing the possibility of a new coal mine in Britain? I mean, you must be furiously opposed to that.
Well, Krishna, as you said, the UK has made big progress when it comes to cutting the use of coal in terms of electricity generation. In 2012, 40% of our electricity generation came from a couple of years ago, it was 2%. And in fact, by 2024, we will ensure that no more coal is used in generating electricity in the UK. When you talk about sort of coal mines, I mean, you know, my role as COP president is to work with countries around the world, including, of course, the United Kingdom, in putting in place policies to deliver a clean world. You know, I think, I hope that gives you some idea of where I am on the issue of coal mines.
And just on Britain's global leadership here, I mean, is this a setback to have, you know, how easy is it for Britain to show global leadership when the Prime Minister is currently mired in controversy and facing an investigation possibly into November?
Well, look, I think on that particular issue, the Prime Minister has been questioned extensively. He set out his views in the House yesterday. He's been very clear that he paid for the Downing Street refurbishment. And of course, he has now appointed Lord Geit to look at these issues. So I think let's wait and see what comes out of that review.
And finally, I mean, just again for you personally, as a British Indian, I just wanted to ask you about the COVID situation in India and whether you are affected by it personally in any way, and whether you're satisfied that Britain is not going to be diverting any of its vaccine doses in this situation.
Well, look, I think what's happening in India is, of course, absolutely devastating. The UK is stepping up and providing support, and you've heard that from the Prime Minister and from the Foreign Secretary. On a personal level, yes, I have a member of my extended family who is living in India, who's got COVID. And of course, my thoughts and prayers are with everyone in India at this difficult time. But you know, I very much hope, and I know that they will get through this, and they have the warm wishes and support of people in the UK, particularly from the diaspora here.
Alok Sharma, thank you very much indeed for your time.